Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's go. The Shadow Collector. Small towns have a way of hiding their secrets. I always thought our little corner of the Midwest was just another sleepy community where nothing ever happened. That all changed one summer. I'm Derek, and I've lived in Maple Hollow my entire life. Nothing exciting ever happens here. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, and gossip spreads faster than a wildfire. But the summer when shadows began disappearing, that changed everything. It started with Jenny Radcliffe, a sweet girl from down the street. She was the kind of person who could brighten any room. One afternoon, she came into the diner where I worked part-time, looking pale and disoriented. "Derek," she whispered, leaning across the counter. "Do you notice anything weird?" I looked her over. Her face was damp with sweat, her auburn hair plastered to her forehead. "You okay, Jenny? You look like you've seen a ghost," I said. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but her voice cracked. It's stupid, but I can't find my shadow." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Your shadow?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's gone. It's just not there anymore." I leaned over the counter to check. Sure enough, the sunlight streaming through the window cast shadows of every customer, except her. The spot where her shadow should have been was blank. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Maybe it's a trick of the light or something. Jenny didn't answer. She just walked out, her movements stiff, almost robotic. Over the next week, more people began losing their shadows. At first, it was a curiosity, an odd little anomaly that the town joked about. Then, the ones without shadows started acting strange. There was Mr. Taylor, the elderly man who ran the hardware store. He began pacing the aisles at night, muttering under his breath. One morning, a neighbor found him staring at his own reflection in a puddle, unblinking for hours. Then there was Carrie, the town librarian. She stopped speaking entirely. She'd just sit behind the counter, staring into space, her hands twitching. It didn't take long before people started leaving town. Those who still had their shadows packed their bags and fled, but not everyone could leave. My mum and I didn't have the money to go anywhere, and honestly, part of me didn't want to. I needed to know what was happening. By the third week, the streets were eerily quiet. The people without shadows didn't talk or interact with anyone anymore. They wandered aimlessly, their movements jerky, like marionettes on invisible strings. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I noticed something strange. The shadows in my room, my dresser, my desk, even my own shadow, seemed to shift as though they were alive. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out. The room was silent, but I swear I saw my shadow flinch. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I'd always been curious, and this was bigger than anything our town had ever faced. I told my best friend Mike about my plan. "You're insane," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe," I admitted, "but we need answers. People are losing their shadows, Mike. This isn't normal." Mike sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, what's the plan?" "There's got to be a connection, right? Something causing this. We start by talking to Jenny." We found her sitting on the porch of her house, staring at the street. She didn't acknowledge us as we approached. "Jenny," I said softly, kneeling beside her. "Do you remember when your shadow disappeared?" She turned her head slowly, her movements mechanical. Her eyes were glassy, empty. "It came at night," she whispered. It stood at the foot of my bed, waiting. What did? Mike asked, his voice shaking. Jenny's lips trembled. The collector. I exchanged a nervous glance with Mike. What's the collector? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. It's watching you, she hissed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jenny's words echoed in my mind. It's watching you. Around midnight, I noticed the shadows in my room moving again. This time, they weren't subtle. They stretched and twisted, crawling up the walls like living things. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of my room. It was impossibly tall, its body made entirely of darkness. No eyes, no face, just a void. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and cold. Who are you? I whispered. It didn't answer. Instead, it pointed at me, a long, shadowy finger extending unnaturally. The next day, I told Mike everything. You're serious? He asked, his face pale. Dead serious, I replied. We decided to break into the old library that night. If there were any records or clues about what was happening, they'd be there. The library was even creepier at night. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight as we searched the archives. Finally, we found something. An old newspaper article from the 1800s. The headline read, "The Shadow Collector Strikes Again." The article described a series of mysterious disappearances in Maple Hollow. People claimed their shadows vanished first, and then they were never seen again. What the hell? Mike muttered, holding the paper with trembling hands. It's been here before, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As we left the library, I felt the air grow colder. The streetlights flickered, and the shadows seemed to ripple around us. It's here, Mike said, his voice shaking. We turned and saw it. The same figure I'd seen in my room. It stood in the middle of the street, its body a writhing mass of darkness. Run! I shouted. We sprinted down the street, but no matter how fast we ran, the figure was always just behind us. Mike tripped and fell, and I turned back to help him. But before I could reach him, the collector extended its shadowy arm. Mike screamed as his shadow was ripped away, leaving him motionless on the ground. I made it home and locked myself in my room, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night or the next. The collector is still out there, taking shadows one by one, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. The Night Watcher. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, ghouls, and creepy bedtime stories always seemed like nonsense, a way to scare kids into behaving. But that was before the Night Watcher came into my life. My name is Rachel, and this is a story I'll never tell anyone aloud. Not because I'm scared they won't believe me, but because some things are better left buried. It started one quiet autumn evening. My dad had just dropped me off at my mum's new house, a modest 2-story tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac. My parents had divorced 6 months earlier, and this was her way of starting fresh. It's nice, right? She asked, her voice overly cheerful as she gave me the tour. It's fine, I replied, trying not to sound too bitter. My room was on the 2nd floor, and the window faced the street. That first night, as I unpacked, I glanced outside. The streetlight at the corner cast a pale orange glow over the pavement, and beneath it stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a neighbour, a tall man in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. But as I watched, he didn't move. He didn't shift his weight, adjust his stance, or even look around. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring directly at my window. I closed the blinds, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy waiting for his dog or something. The next morning, I hesitated before looking outside. The figure was gone, and I felt a wave of relief. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. But that night he was back. Same spot, same stance, staring up at my window. "Mom!" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's up?" "There's a guy standing outside, under the streetlight." She frowned and walked over to the window, pulling back the blinds. She squinted, then looked back at me. "There's no one there, Rachel." I stared, dumbfounded. The man was still there, clear as day. His coat seemed to ripple faintly in the breeze. "Are you serious? He's right there." Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long day." She left the room, and I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed at me. The third night, I decided to document it. I borrowed Mom's old digital camera and set it up on my desk, aimed at the window. When the figure appeared again, I snapped a series of photos, heart pounding. The next morning, I eagerly loaded the images onto my laptop. The photos showed the streetlight, the empty sidewalk, and nothing else. Nothing else. I started to notice changes. My mum was too busy with work to pay much attention, but I became jumpy and paranoid. At school, my best friend Julie asked me if I was okay. "You've been acting off," she said, studying me over the edge of her lunch tray. "I'm fine," I lied, but I wasn't. I hadn't slept in days, too scared to close my eyes. Every night the figure was there, unwavering. Then, one evening, as I walked home from Julie's house, I saw him. He wasn't under the streetlight this time. He was at the end of the block, standing perfectly still, waiting. I ran the rest of the way home, my chest tight with fear. "Rachel, what's wrong?" Mum asked as I slammed the door behind me. "Nothing," I gasped, clutching the banister for support. "Just nothing." That night, I tried something different. I closed the blinds, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark. Maybe if I didn't look, he'd go away. But when I peeked out an hour later, he was standing closer. The following week, I convinced Mum to let me stay at Dad's place for a while. I didn't tell her the real reason, just mumbled something about wanting a change of scenery. Dad's house was on the other side of town, far from that cursed streetlight. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The first night at Dad's, I slept deeply, wrapped in the comforting knowledge that I'd left the night watcher behind. But the second night, as I walked to my bedroom window to close the blinds, I saw him. He was standing in the driveway. I screamed, and Dad came running. "What's wrong?" he demanded, looking around the room. "There's someone outside." He grabbed a flashlight and stormed out the front door, muttering about nosy neighbors. I watched from the window as he shone the light across the yard. Nothing. "Rachel, there's no one here," he called back, his tone frustrated. But I saw the man. He was still there, standing just outside the flashlight's beam, completely still. I tried everything to make him go away. I ignored him. I screamed at him. I even tried praying, though I'd never been religious. Nothing worked. He followed me everywhere. School, the park, the grocery store. Always at a distance, always watching. One night, I had enough. I opened my bedroom window and shouted into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" For the first time, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped into the light. His face was pale, featureless, like a blank mask. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, unbroken skin. He raised his hand and pointed at me again. I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, I turned to Julie for help. "I believe you," she said, after I finally spilled everything. "We'll figure this out together." We spent hours researching urban legends, hauntings, and shadow people. The closest thing we found was an old story about watchers, beings that latch onto people and follow them until they take them. "What does that mean, take them?" I asked. Julie shook her head. "I don't know. But we're not letting that happen to you." That night, Julie stayed over. As the clock struck midnight, the figure appeared outside my window. "He's there," I whispered. Julie looked, her face pale. "Rachel, I see him." For the first time, someone else saw him too. We held hands, trembling, as the figure slowly approached the house. The next morning, Julie was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, her shoes by the door. I searched everywhere, but there was no sign of her. When I looked outside, I saw her standing under the streetlight. She didn't wave or speak. She just stared up at my window, her eyes wide and empty. And behind her, the night watcher waited. The Screaming Woods. Camping had always been a family tradition for us, though I often wondered why. My dad, Frank, loved the outdoors, and my mum, Karen, tolerated it for his sake. My younger brother, Lucas, lived for the campfires and s'mores. As for me, Harper, I wasn't much of a fan. Mosquitoes, sleeping bags, and no Wi-Fi weren't exactly my idea of a good time. But this trip was supposed to be special. Dad had found an undiscovered gem in the middle of nowhere. A secluded patch of forest off an unmarked trail. No official campsites, no crowds. Just us and the great outdoors. "You'll love it," Dad had said as we packed up the car. "It's pristine." It wasn't love I felt when we pulled up to the edge of the forest hours later. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Shadows pooled in every corner, even though the sun was still hanging low in the sky. "It's remote," Mum said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "It's perfect," Dad replied, grinning ear to ear. I wasn't so sure. The first day passed uneventfully. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. Dad made sure the fire pit was just right, and Lucas ran around collecting sticks. I tried to get a signal on my phone to no avail. By nightfall, we were roasting hot dogs over the fire and laughing as Lucas told terrible jokes. It wasn't until we were settling into our tents that I first heard it. A scream. It came from deep within the forest. A high-pitched, gut-wrenching wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mum, who was zipping up our shared tent. She froze, her hand hovering over the zipper. "It's probably just an animal," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Lucas popped his head out of his tent. "What was that?" "Nothing," Dad said firmly. "Coyotes, maybe. Go to sleep." But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. The second night, the screams came again. This time, they were louder, more desperate. They started around midnight, echoing through the trees. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from. They seemed to surround us, bouncing off the trunks and branches. I stayed awake, clutching my flashlight, while Mum pretended to sleep beside me. When the screams finally stopped, whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I strained to hear, I realized they were words. "Come closer. Help us. Please." They repeated over and over, soft and insistent. The next morning I asked Dad if he'd heard them. "It's just your imagination," he said, though his jaw was tight. Let's enjoy the day. But I knew he'd heard them too. By the third night, we were all on edge. The screams started earlier, just after sunset. Lucas huddled by the fire, his marshmallow untouched. Mom paced nervously, her eyes darting toward the darkened forest. "I think we should leave," she said, breaking the tense silence. Dad shook his head. "It's just animals. We've got a few more days planned." "It's not animals, Frank," she snapped, her voice trembling. "This place isn't right." He didn't respond, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. That night, the whispers came again. This time, they weren't just outside the tent. They were inside. I woke up to the sound of Mom's voice, though her lips weren't moving. "Harper," the voice said, soft and melodic. "Come outside." I bolted upright, my heart hammering. Mom was fast asleep beside me, her face pale and drawn. "Harper," the voice repeated. "We need you." It wasn't her voice anymore. It was distorted, deep and wet, like something trying to imitate her. I scrambled out of the tent, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest loomed around me, dark and silent. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I saw Lucas standing at the edge of the clearing. "Lucas?" I called out, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. His back was to me, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening to something. "Lucas!" I shouted, louder this time. He turned, but something was wrong. His eyes were wide and blank, his expression slack. He raised a hand, pointing into the forest. "They're waiting," he said, his voice monotone. We found him an hour later, curled up in his sleeping bag. "It wasn't me," he insisted, tears streaming down his face. "I never left the tent." None of us slept after that. At dawn, Dad announced we were leaving. We packed up the camp in record time, not even bothering with breakfast. As we trudged back toward the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers followed us, growing louder the deeper we went. "Stay. You belong here. Don't leave." I glanced over my shoulder and froze. Figures were moving between the trees. At first they looked like shadows, tall and thin, barely more than outlines. But as they drew closer, I saw their faces. They looked like us. We ran the rest of the way to the car, the whispers turning into screams. "Get in!" Dad yelled, fumbling with the keys. As we sped away, I looked back one last time. The forest was still, the figures gone, but the whispers lingered, faint and mocking. "See you soon." We never went camping again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the screams, and I know they're still waiting.
You've heard the horrors. Subscribe if you want to keep the spirits on your side. Until next time, pleasant dreams.